Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Pretoria, Professor Tawane Kupe, Professor Molly Brown, Head of the Department of English, Professor Corinne Sandwith, Professor in the Department of English, distinguished guests, members of staff, and students. Good evening and welcome to this inaugural lecture to be presented by Professor Sandwith in the Faculty of Humanities. You are, of course, welcome to leave a comment in the live chat box during the lecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kupe to do the formal welcome and to introduce Professor Sandwith.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning if you are listening from across the world. A warm welcome to this inaugural lecture to be presented by our colleague, Professor Corinne Sandwith from the Department of English, Faculty of Humanities, University of Pretoria. Inaugural lectures are important. It's when we hear what the professor professes. Corinne Sandwith is Professor of English at the University of Pretoria, South Africa, and is the author of The World of Letters, Reading Communities and Cultural Debates in Early Apartheid South Africa, published in 2014, and co-editor with M.J. Diamond of South Africa, Viewpoints 1958 to 1961. Her research is broadly focused on early 20th century South African reading and print cultures. Her current book project focuses on the Black print sphere and Black newspapers in particular, as an understudied archive of political intellectual life, looking at questions of the life and form of the newspaper, everyday epistemologies, women's intellectual history, as well as practices of citation, circulation, and affiliation. Ladies and gentlemen, our inaugurating professor, Professor Corinne Sandwith, the inaugurating professor, your audience tonight.
Good evening, and thank you, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Pretoria, Professor Kupe, and the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Reddy. Warm greetings to family and friends who have tuned in from outside, as well as to those who are present here. Special and infinite thanks to my partner, Angela Spencer, and our daughter, Juno. I would like to dedicate this lecture to my dear late mum, Faye Whitaker, and to my cherished friend and colleague, Khulukazi Soldati Kahimbara. I start with a comment by Mike Kirkwood. The cultural history of South Africa is best represented as a heap of fragments cut off from each other. Each generation lopped off, stopped in its tracks by exile, imprisonment, or some form of cultural oppression imposed by the ruling cultural group. Drawing on Zoe Wickham's idea of the whole as a thing of absence, Shane Graham invokes the metaphor of digging up the past and suggests that narrating the past must always be an inductive enterprise, one of decoding meaning through absence, loss, and rupture. As A.C. Jordan's pioneering series of essays on African literature attests, much of this fragmented history is to be found in the popular periodical press. In this lecture, I detail some of the historical digging projects I have engaged in over the past 25 years or so. Following Jordan, I read South African periodical print culture and the publics they convened as key sites for the recovery of lost or hidden intellectual cultural traditions. The reconstruction of this alternative archive necessitates a methodology of reading and historicizing the fragment. It involves the analysis of traces, bits and pieces, oddments, and remainders. So working with a discontinuous, incomplete archive demands a reading of gaps, a reading across gaps, and always provisional methodology of juxtaposition and tentative assemblage, and an equally tentative analysis of the patterns these fragments form and the ways in which they shift over time. So I begin with two fragments. The April 1950 edition of The Voice magazine, a small mimeographed periodical published from the Johannesburg township of Orlando, featured a piece by regular contributor Naledi, pen name of Eskiam Patlele. The subject was a recent Yehudi Menuhin concert, belatedly arranged for black audiences after opposition arose to the fact that the renowned violinist would only appear before whites. It's all over now, the Menuhin concert. I'm not a music critic and all that. I listened with my native ear, surrendered myself to the effects of the music. I don't know anything about E minor or E major. They mean nothing to my simple, untutored mind. But Bach's concerto in E major and Mendelssohn's in E minor brought that night sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart, and feelings too of unremembered pleasure, as Wordsworth says. So if on hearing that music I may have seen some maiden amid the alien corn, fairy lands forlorn, the crystal streams, a river flowing through caverns, measureless to man, down to a sunless sea, or meandering in a mazy motion, or alone upon a branch that's bare, a trembling leaf left behind, or may have heard the wailing of a god in pain, it is because the height of poetic truth reached by the composer struck on the lyrical strings of my being. In this intervention, Mpatlele undertakes a self-effacing, sardonic protest against apartheid cultural exclusions via a parody of native ignorance and a flamboyant, excessive assemblage of high romantic reference. Assuming the pose of the romantic sufferer, Mpatlele makes an emotive appeal for the right to participate in a humanist culture and reinforces his claim through the conspicuous, accumulative performance of Western civilizational accomplishment. In another example of writing during apartheid, published in Staffrider magazine in 1979, Durban poet Mafika Gwala takes up a defense not of black rights to a proscribed culture, but rather of the recent efflorescence of political poetry by black writers and the black consciousness philosophy that underpinned it. People who tamper with black consciousness and the black experience better watch it from now. The days of paradisal innocence are over. Anyone who has an intellectual or moral quarrel with black terms of reference within the given reality of white baskup and black depravity is on the other side of the line, and therefore in favor of the status quo. I wish to point out that black consciousness does not mean politics disguised as literature, neither does it mean anti-white writing, as some head shrinkers love to categorize. Black consciousness helps to fight the bourgeois and at times neo-fascist context of white terms of reference within the apartheid reality. Black consciousness to us means the structuring of an alternative context to the apartheid context. As Herbert Marcuse aptly pointed out, one must revoke the Ninth Symphony, not only because it is wrong and false, we cannot and should not sing an ode to joy, not even as promise, but also because it is there, and it is true in its own right. It stands in our universe as the justification of the illusion which is no longer justifiable. Apartheid is there in its own right, on terms determined by a selfish minority. We revoke it. So the differences in tone, register, and political purpose could not be more striking. Where Mpatlele deploys the mode of ambivalent, ironic mimicry, Gwala is confrontational and direct. Whereas Mpatlele grounds an appeal for inclusion in the performance of civility, Gwala points to a racially polarized field and draws on the emancipatory possibilities of radical critical theory in order to revoke bourgeois high culture in its entirety and to expose its oppressive effects. Especially noteworthy is the interpolation of Marcuse's arguments within a black consciousness problematic. So both of these interventions arose in response to the injustice of apartheid rule, which built on and intensified an already well-established segregationist regime. The differences in their responses have everything to do with the history that separates them. The implementation of Bantu education in 1956, the institution of a plethora of racially discriminatory laws, a massive project of socio-spatial engineering, political protests and fatal police repression, the banning of the ANC and the PAC, the rise of the Black Consciousness movement, and the 1976 Soweto riots. These cultural interventions were not only an important index of changing historical circumstances and the cultural responses they provoked, they are also a striking exemplification of a long and vital history of dissonant cultural debate, much of which remains unknown. What is claimed here, and what these examples amply demonstrate, is that political struggles in South Africa were frequently articulated in cultural terms, and that forms of political critique often took shape as arguments about literature and the reading of texts. What this recognition demands is an amplified understanding of the history of political struggle as played out in part in aesthetic cultural terms. The projects of historical recovery that I've been involved in have centered on various forms of print culture production, the newspaper, the periodical, the little magazine, but have also extended to more ephemeral activities of drama groups, debating societies, and social clubs, all of which are understood as important sites for the production of alternative intellectual and cultural perspectives. Also unearthed in this process are marginalized histories of reading, interpretation, intellectual life, and public scholarship. A reading of South African intellectual history through the lens of periodical print culture also helps to shed light on hidden histories of Black women's public sphere engagements, a history that has been particularly vulnerable to erasure. So a methodology of reading the fragment is accompanied by a focus on the social lives of print, a practice of relational or affinitive reading which acknowledges the multiple textual entanglements, affiliations, and borrowings that mark the South African print and public spheres. So here I'm thinking of the movement and circulation of various texts and aesthetic and rhetorical styles, and the ways in which they become reshaped and repurposed in successive contexts. Particularly important here are the widespread practices of citation and the appropriation and rewriting of Western canonical and popular texts to incite new meanings and new political possibilities. Relational reading is also concerned with the multiple intersections and connections between newspapers and periodicals themselves, and the central role of periodical culture in forging intra-African, Pan-Africanist, and diasporic imaginaries. In this sense, my research has widened from tracking a history of dissonant aesthetics and alternative reading cultures to consider the periodical press more generally as an overlooked archive of Black intellectual life, literary culture, political debate, and transnational connection. This has also led to an expanded focus on the distinctive form of the periodical: ephemeral, iterative, multimodal, heteroglossic, and addressive, and to a consideration of what this newspaper form makes possible. Dissonant intellectual traditions in South Africa developed in close proximity to the Communist Party, as well as a number of Trotskyist-linked discussion groups. The late 1930s saw the emergence of the South African chapter of the Left Book Club, and in 1938, the launch of the Guardian newspaper. These, along with Trek magazine and Fighting Talk, became important sites of left-leaning cultural discussion throughout the 1940s. The Torch, a publication of the non-European unity movement, emerged in the late 1940s, as did the aforementioned Voice, along with several left-aligned discussion groups. The launch of Nat Nagasa's The Classic in 1963 inaugurated a new phase in this history, as post-Sharpeville repression began to take its toll on the lives of writers and the bounds of permissible speech. This was followed in the mid-1970s by Sipho Sepamla's New Classic, Jackie Soroke's revived Classic, and the launch in 1978 of Staffrider magazine. Extending this focus, one turns to the more prosaic form of the weekly newspaper and the publics they convened as equally important locations of Black intellectual engagement. In this sense, my research homes in on a number of early 20th century newspapers as part of a wider project of mapping the South African Black print sphere. So in this lecture, I'm going to highlight 4 main areas of focus in the broader project of reading hidden intellectual traditions through the lens of popular print culture. So we start with the dissonant cultural debates, then we move to periodicals as alternative writing and publishing arenas, 3 women's appropriations of the newspaper space, and 4 newspapers' activation of transnational and anti-colonial imaginaries. And don't be alarmed, the first section is quite a lot longer than all the rest. So yeah, I won't keep you too long. So first of all, dissonant cultural debates. As Mphatlele's intervention makes clear, the performance of satirical irreverence has been a tremendously productive resource for the marginal intellectual. In various public interventions in the 30s and 40s, commentators deployed an arch, ironic mode in order to expose the liberal premise that the non-racial franchise was linked to the demonstration of an appropriate civility. Intellectuals associated with the Torch newspaper, for example, derided this spurious cult of respectability that called for the conspicuous demonstration of civilizational advancement as, quote, a state of chronic expectation in which people waited to be declared fully human. The satirical posture was also a key tactic of Rolf Dlomo's Roma column in the Bantu World, as it was in the political polemics of Trek and The Voice. In the popular column Rabelais and His World, which appeared in The Voice from the late 1940s, Mphatlele satirized Afrikaner nationalism via the figure of Baas Pieter and the Society of Rooikop. This playfully resistant stance is also exemplified in satirical rewritings of Western canonical texts, such as Milton's Paradise Lost and Byron's Vision of Judgment, both of which are simultaneously honored and disfigured as heretical commentaries on Afrikaner nationalism and the absurdities of apartheid rule. So this satirical mode continues well into the 50s and the early 1960s, as evident, for example, in Alex Laguma's New Age column Up My Alley, Nagasa's articles in the Rand Daily Mail, and Casey Mositsi's On the Beat column in Drum. A closely allied strategy, which was also a distinctive feature of the writing of both Rolf Dlomo and the NEF intellectual Ben Kies, had to do with the English language itself, undermined from within through practices of verbal play, stylistic virtuosity, semantic disruption, and verbal ebullience. The strategy was key to the polemics in The Torch, in which a general stance of questioning and refusal was augmented with the devices of hyperbole, malapropism, and the rejection of polite speech. The above examples confirm not only the political traction of the ironic and satirical modes in South African letters, but also the importance of the semiotic arena itself as a space in which dominant codes are unwritten and defaced. As Mphatlele's essay also indicates, the cultural debates of the 1950s were dominated by claims to the right to participate in and enjoy Western high culture. Black intellectuals took issue with apartheid obsessions with cultural purity through the repetitive, often ironic assertion of a modern, urbanized, cosmopolitan identity. This was evidenced in part in the performative mode, in stylistic experimentation and hybridization, and in practices of incessant interpolation and rewriting. It was also evident in an important early theorization of culture as a transnational and unbounded space of encounter, one which is enmeshed with and invigorated by adjacent cultural systems. Activist intellectuals emphasized historical, spatial, and cultural entanglement, drawing on biological tropes of cross-pollination and diversity to undermine the normative position. They presented a view of cultural identity as syncretized, layered, and complex, and opposed prevailing assumptions about cultural inheritance with a model of cultural transmission. As Mphatlele's essay makes clear, in the hyper-racialized environments of 1950 South Africa, dissonant cultural politics take shape not as the spurning of Western culture, but rather as an assertion of entitlement to a world culture. Resistant political gestures are also inscribed in the act of reading itself, the ways in which literature was interpreted, assessed, and in various modes of parsing the text and of understanding its place in the world. Central to the dissident reading cultures of the 40s and 50s was the relationship between politics and art, against a guild-based insistence on their separation and a corresponding hostility to the arts of political inscription. Cultural activists argued for their necessary entanglement. Thus, they drew on a materialist understanding of literature as inflected in various ways by the wider socio-political context. A.C. Jordan's 1946 post-colonial reading of The Tempest at a meeting of the Teachers' League of South Africa is a striking example. He says, "If you want a clear picture of the situation in South Africa, you will get it in The Tempest. Prospero taught Caliban just sufficient Italian to be able to carry the logs of wood. He did not teach him reading and writing because Caliban's knowledge of these was no convenience to Prospero. It just suited Prospero that Caliban thought his master's magic power lay in the books. All that Caliban could use Italian for was cursing, to which curses Prospero could afford to sit back and listen with the complacency of the elephant because they did not threaten his security. To Prospero, a Caliban remains a Caliban and has no claim on his respect, even if he rises above the level of the drunken butler and the drunken seaman when he hears music." Valued primarily for its didactic import, The Tempest is read as a play that unmasks the operations of colonial rule, reveals the ambiguous function of colonial education, and exposes the emptiness of the liberal promise that the performance of civility will lead to political rights. In this reading, The Tempest accrues new interpretive significance as a parable of colonialism, revealing the intricate and oppressive dynamics of the colonial pact. The location of literary criticism in the thick of political argument is also significant. The essay shifts seamlessly from political rhetoric to literary analysis, thus diminishing conventional distinctions and unsettling the privileged status of literary form. So, turning to the reading cultures of the Stalinist left, we tend to see an idea of the text as a site of education and political emancipation. Cultural activists place particular emphasis on realist portraits of social abjection and heroic resistance, and some of the more popular texts in the left-wing canon that circulated across a range of reading communities were John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, Jack London's Iron Heel, Maxim Gorky's The Mother, and Richard Wright's Native Son. The period also sees an important early South African engagement with a Marxist aesthetic, some 30 years before its appearance in the South African Academy. Two important examples are Dora Taylor's monthly book reviews in Trek magazine in the 1940s, and Jack Cope's long-running Art and the People column in The Guardian. A report on the inaugural meeting of the Non-European Writers' Arts Congress, held in Johannesburg in 1946, provides a glimpse into other aesthetic priorities during this period. Writers at this Congress insisted on the importance of literary representations of secular black modernity against black deurbanization. They welcomed what they saw as an important shift from the politically evasive, moral dealing stories of the colonial mission tradition to those depicting, quote, the slumdom of the gold mining compounds and the fenced, ghetto-reminiscent native location, and anticipated the emergence of a faithless but vigorous literature of frustration, protest, indignation, abuse, and iconoclastic rebellion. In the 1950s, the argument that no text is politically neutral was accompanied by an early theorization of the role of culture in fostering mental slavery. Cultural activists responded to this problem with a hermeneutics of suspicion and a practice of ideological critique centered on the violence of representation and the politics of the text. Many of these interventions were directed towards identifying examples of racist distortion and stereotyping in South African white writing. A particularly resonant example is the response that greeted the publication of a glowing review of Alan Paton's Cry the Beloved Country. The review, published in The Torch, elicited a flood of angry letters, pointing to its dope-peddling politics, its reinforcement of tribalization, and its elevation of political quiescence. In the resulting political fallout, the hapless reviewer was called upon to explain his political creed. These reading communities are noteworthy for a pervasive habit of questioning and critique, an interrogative rather than a deferential reading practice in which literary criticism is explicitly refashioned as a mode of political engagement. For these critics, literary criticism is social criticism. It is charged with judgment and rooted in the need for social change. In these and other forums, literary texts are drawn into wider political debates, and the literary artifact is reimagined as a kind of intellectual commons or public sphere, just one of many elements in a wider discursive field. While practices of ideological critique continue into the early 1960s, a far more urgent task from the 1950s was the rewriting of literary history. This includes an explicit emphasis on reversing the distortions of the colonial library, as well as a marked emphasis on traditional forms and indigenous languages, which were seen as dynamic sites of adaptation rather than as static repositories of conservative values. Key literary mappings in this regard include A.C. Jordan's articles in Africa South, several histories of Black literature published in Fighting Talk, as well as a series of key interventions in the classic, new classic, and Staffrider. The art-politics debate only intensified in the cultural discussions of the 70s and 80s, with similar, although more disconcerting, implications for white critics. The debate was foregrounded in the introductory comments of all 3 Black literary magazines launched during this period, and was the subject of a number of key critical interventions. Writers combined these and other arguments for political purpose with a renewed interest in traditional African understandings of art as socially useful, people-oriented, and community-based. As in the radical pre-Sharpeville traditions, literature is not confined to the printed page, but understood as reaching outwards, as judgment, expose, inspiration, education, and catalyst to the wider social reality. What distinguishes these debates from those of the pre-Sharpeville era is the impetus of the new Black consciousness philosophy, particularly its more pointed and more racialized understanding of the importance of the cultural sphere for a reivindication of Blackness against demeaning apartheid designations as, quote, a necessary precondition to total freedom. Echoing earlier preoccupations, cultural activists asserted an alternative set of claims in direct contention with a powerful institutional consensus and increasingly against what was described as the misleading enemy critic. This new generation of writer activists approached the Western literary canon and its critical apparatus as an integral part of Western imperialism. This period thus sees a particular and pointed resistance to dominant notions of artistic detachment and disinterestedness, and the related dismissal of Black literature and poetry as, quote, nothing more than the shrill, hysterical, thinly disguised political propaganda. For Mbolelo Mzimane, it is ridiculous to expect sweet Handelian music from the oppressed, unless the oppressed acquiesce to sing like the slaves of old for their master's gratification. In the volatile 1980s, against the universalizing claims of the Western literary tradition, Black consciousness writers called for the formation of a distinctive Black aesthetic and a Black-centered scholarship. Black critics were encouraged to seize the tools of interpretation from, quote, the monopoly of aliens and outsiders, and to develop specifically Black standards of judgment as part of a practice of self-definition and reinterpretation. As Sipamla asserted at the launch of New Classic, we are tired of being spoken for, thought about, and wheeled around. This memory of our blackness we want to obliterate. Now is the time to articulate new definitions. Like others, Sipamla sought to demythologize blackness and called for a more profound structural change. In contrast to the old habits of, quote, speaking to the deaf ears of those in power, black writers are urged towards defiant acts of self-definition. As Faisal Johannes and Neil Alwyn Williams put it, instead of blaming ourselves on history, we have taken our history and repossessed it. The emergence of Staffrider in 1978 was a powerful and subversive response to this white-dominated cultural context, one which also altered the contemporary literary cultural scene in profound ways. Placed in opposition to officially sanctioned culture and its concomitant aims of domination, the magazine carved out a democratic, community-based, and quotidian space of cultural production away from the institutional gaze and went out of its way to encourage publication by young and inexperienced writers. In this way, the magazine reinforced a move towards a more democratic understanding of the writer-audience relationship and a more participatory, reciprocal aesthetic. In this project of cultural democratization, it was important to wrest editorial control from powerful institutions and personalities through the adoption of a loose editorial structure and a practice of self-editing, in which decisions about literary merit were handed over to the writers themselves. So what binds this resistant history, stretching from the late 1930s to the 1980s? First, a defense of political art, the concern with representation of black history and experience, the refusal of Western aesthetic norms, and the promotion of alternative interpretive schemes. There are important discontinuities, however. A decisive shift from sardonic critique and the ambiguous occupation of a humanist Western culture to a much more deep-rooted and uncompromising refusal of what is understood as an inherently racialized terrain comprising white terms of reference, Western bourgeois artifacts, and white regulation. This is accompanied by a sharpened understanding of the role of Western culture in propping up imperialist schemes, and a much more emphatic turn to black intellectuals and writers as mediators of their own experience and aesthetic judgments, as a step towards the repossession of history. So moving to my second section, I turn to the central role that newspapers, magazines, and periodicals played as platforms, incubators, or hosts of black literary expression. Multilingual, black-oriented newspapers in particular provided a crucial literary infrastructure for the publication and circulation of literature by black authors, publishing circuits that also circumvented the established centers of the mission and metropolitan press. The serialization of Thomas Mafolo's early novels in Leselinyana, Notsitsi Mkweto's poetry in Teteli wa Bantu in the mid-1920s, Peter Abrams's 1930s protest poetry in Bantu World, Rolf Dlomo's short stories in Shambok, and the many poems, short stories, and serializations published in Fighting Talk, Drum, and Staffrider are just some examples of this rich alternative tradition of newspaper literature. A reading of South African newspaper literature leads to an important insight that in more instances than perhaps is realized, black literary expression did not take the form of the quiet published book, was not subject to what Herbert Lomo described as the critical hands of the publisher, but arose in the polyphonous, noisy, demotic space of the popular newspaper and magazine. In contrast to the careful preparation of books in the cool library atmosphere, black South African writing is made and tested within the much more volatile, porous, and experimental space of the newspaper text, finding traction, connection, or simply disappearing within a cacophony of voices, performances, and genres, including advertisements, sermons, government notices, letters, leaders, and cartoons. What has been overlooked in the scholarship thus far is the extent to which these quotidian publishing contexts shape particular reading practices and practices of consumption. Read in relation to a range of adjacent texts and performances, the poem or short story is likely to accrue unanticipated meanings as the text is opened up to multiple potential dialogues across the printed page. Its location in the thick of contemporary news and opinion in particular leads to a reading of the text that privileges its publicness, its outward orientation, thus encouraging more quotidian, more politicized, and less inward modes of reader engagement. In these publishing contexts, the literary text becomes just one of a number of rhetorical performances on the printed page. It is automatically drawn into and made coterminous with an interactive, contentious space of public discussion and political debate. In this way, the idea of literature as a privileged artifact gives way to the reading of literature as part of a wider political intellectual commons. The second point to note is the kinds of literary and stylistic experiments that the newspaper form makes possible, that the immediate, ephemeral form of the newspaper, as well as its commercial imperatives, encouraged greater risk-taking, innovation, and genre bending. Thus, the reflective essay might employ the fictional devices of dialogue and scene setting. The letter might resolve its argument with a poem. The personal anecdote and the satirical column might experiment with modes of reader address and playful literary style. The evidence suggests that writers exploited the elasticity of the periodical format to experiment with hybrid styles and new ways of writing, hybrid genres and new styles of writing. The turn to a more fluid, experimental style was also facilitated by the widespread adoption of pseudonyms and the eccentric print personas that these made possible. Taken together, this rich history of newspaper literature points to the limits of approaching the history of Black literary expression solely in terms of conventional literary forms, and in this light suggests that existing understandings of early 20th century Black literary history could be revisited. So here I single out one particularly striking example of early 20th century newspaper literature, a popular column that appeared over a period of 10 years in the Bantu world from 1933 to 1944. Written by Rolf Dlomo, who used the pseudonym R. Roma Esquire, the column details both the pleasures and the constraints of the racial city through the everyday ramblings and microscopic observations of the Black flaneur. Favoring the mode of offbeat, deadpan, satirical humor, the column represents one of the earliest non-moralizing takes on Black urban space, not the Jim comes to Joburg tale of fateful urban encounter followed by chastened rural retreat, but an important early narration of Black cosmopolitan urbanity, which predates the appearance of Drum City inscription by some 20 years. Lomo's idiosyncratic and oblique political satire of segregationist Johannesburg is striking for its vivacious and idiosyncratic style, one which joins a fragmented and non-teleological form with humor, polyphony, and ventriloquism. Lomo's satire of the proto-apartheid city is aimed as much at a context of racial indictment as the violence of state language. Roma's word games, code switching, textual illusion, and irreverent attitudes towards the English language provide a way of negotiating the authority of the institution and its powers of interpolation, naming, and shaming. By harnessing the devices of fiction, scene setting, characterization, and mobile narrative perspective, Dlomo's columns offer a multifaceted, polyphonal, often contradictory reading of the Black urban scene that works against the reductionist, racist templates of the proto-apartheid state. Third section, women's appropriation of the newspaper space. So the third aspect of the history of South Africa's marginal intellectual traditions that I would like to highlight are the ways in which Black women in particular use the ambiguous and contested space of the women's page to assert a claim to a male-dominated public sphere and to advance their own writing and intellectual agendas. Bantu World newspaper launched its women's page on the 1st of October 1932, the first of its kind in the history of the African-oriented press and one of the most successful. Its appearance was prompted by a letter from Mrs. Gladys Ramokwena, who noticed the absence of articles by women writers and proposed that Bantu World include a weekly column devoted to women's affairs. In an unsurprising irony, the job of editing the women's page fell to a man, none other than the aforementioned Rolf Lomo. While the white women journalist was a commonplace feature of the period, the same could not be said of black women. The launch of the English language women's page in Bantu World seems to have opened up possibilities for black women's writing in important ways, and within a matter of weeks, it had become a popular forum in which a small but significant group of African women, writing mostly in English, took up the opportunity for public debate through the writing of letters and short articles. I want to pull out a few strands of this interesting story. The first underscores the importance of the women's page for an understanding of black women's literary history. As much Western feminist scholarship has revealed, British and North American women's literature traces its origins to the transitional genres of memoir, letter, and essay, all of which provide non-sanctioned and therefore less prescriptive spaces for women's writing. A similar set of conditions allowed for the emergence of African women's writing in the South African context. Thus, the genealogy of black women's literature can only be properly traced through an investigation of the history of women's writing in other non-literary forms and forums. By drawing attention to some of the pioneering, albeit trivialized or occluded journalistic interventions by African women, such as Rosi Kabela, Mary Mabel Mpulo, and Joanna Patlane, something of the prehistory or pretexts of later black women's writing in South Africa becomes visible. The second strand serves to make the point that women writers appropriated and refashioned what tended to be a fairly conservative or formulaic arena to their own ends. What is striking in the early years of the Bantu World's women's page is the way in which it was almost immediately taken up as a site for the articulation of women's personal stories, which in some respect pushed the discussion beyond the conventional modes of moralizing instruction into ideal femininity, such as the recipe for quince jam, which you might like to jot down. Adopting an intimate mode of readerly address, women readers resisted the conventional top-down and didactic gestures of the women's page by refashioning the page as a space of female friendship, solidarity, encounter, sharing, and support. The third strand notes the debates about gender questions, which the page also initiated. One of the curious aspects of the history of the Bantu World women's page is that it became the focus of great interest for male correspondents, who seized the opportunity the paper provided to indulge in various forms of mansplaining, female shaming, and censure. In fact, for long periods, the page was quite overrun with male correspondents, thus compromising the fragile, female-centered space that women had succeeded in creating. In mounting their attacks on modern urban femininity, lazy, fickle, loose women of various descriptions, many of these correspondents turned to the resources of a misogynist Western literary tradition. In the face of this intrusion, some women fell silent, others carved out a precarious space by ventriloquizing the dominant view, and still others launched stinging attacks of their own. As one correspondent put it, "It is getting into our nerves, this criticism of us in the papers by men. All they are waiting for is to see some unfortunate woman in error, and then they rush to the press." Other correspondents took aim at the practices of misogynist citation itself. Thus, a woman using the pen name A Constant Reader from Escort takes issue with a series of articles written under the pseudonym of Voice. As Constant Reader put it, "This voice is more like an exhaust pipe. It congests the paper and monopolizes time." Writers like Joanna Patlale, who adopted the pseudonym Lady Porcupine, perhaps very appropriate for this space, negotiated the equivocal space of the women's page by working from within, by adopting the pose of charming, spirited, sometimes prickly entertainer, and generally writing to please. Although working largely within a conservative paradigm, her views also exemplify a more widespread newspaper engagement with gender norms from an emergent Black feminist perspective. In an ongoing debate about women's right to work, for example, she dismisses the consensual view that women will be unsexed by their entry into male professions, pointing to the many instances of men doing women's work with no apparent ill effects. Even so, she remarks, every silly clown of a fellow begins to cackle when a cultured and capable woman claims the right to take part in the control of a municipality or state. And finally, newspapers' activation of transnational anti-colonial imaginaries. I end with a very brief account of the role that the periodical press played in activating transnational anti-colonial imaginaries and connections. Here, the focus falls on the many newspaper debates and public interventions that emerged in response to the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1935, an event that was interpreted by most commentators as an unequivocal example of colonial aggression against the last Black independent nation. What is striking about these newspaper engagements, which took the form of letters, articles, poems, and cartoons, was the way in which they drew into prominence and also reactivated a much older Black Ethiopianist discourse centered on a heterodox, emancipatory reading of biblical texts as a key decolonial gesture. Of particular importance for these reading communities was the resonant prophecy of Psalm 68, verse 31, which declares, "Princes shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall haste to stretch out her hands unto God." In the context of the Italian invasion, this biblical text provided a vital resource for reimagining Black history and culture as dignified and valuable, while also offering redemptive visions of the restoration of African pasts and the possibility of future retributive justice and white exile. The various appropriations, echoes, and rewritings of this biblical verse, many of which were cut and pasted from other newspapers through various networks of print exchanges, are to be found in many newspapers across the African continent and the Black diaspora. These and other newspaper engagements with the Italian invasion helped to inaugurate and reinforce latent understandings of Pan-African, Black Atlantic, Indian Oceanic, and other kinds of affiliations, and assisted in reimagining national colonial histories as a shared African predicament. Newspaper responses to the Abyssinian moment thus give us insight into a little-known early articulation of anti-colonial thinking in South Africa, one which anticipates the more celebrated anti-colonial gestures of the post-Second World War period. Newspaper debates also reveal the inherently transnational, diasporic character of African modernity itself, and that the local political claims of stateless subjects were articulated within the more expansive imaginary of shared Black experience. And that's where I end. Thank you very much.
Colleagues and distinguished guests, please join me in congratulating Professor Sandwith. Thank you for an important contribution to our understanding of a cultural history of South Africa, which is shaped in part by your intellectual journey, which you described to be the historical digging projects that you've engaged in over the last 30 or odd years. Prof. Sandwith has persuasively emphasized that the social lives of print is a practice of relational or affinitive reading, which acknowledges the multiple textual entanglements, affiliations, and borrowings that shape the South African print and public spheres. She highlights 4 areas in a project of reading the hidden intellectual political traditions through the lens of popular print culture and the public sphere. And I shall not repeat what she has highlighted in the fourfold narrative in her lecture. She demonstrates the utility of a relational reading that directs us to the multiple intersections and connections between newspapers and periodicals, and of course the central role of the periodical press in forging what she has termed intra-African, pan-Africanist, diasporic, and internationalist imaginaries and solidarities. Prof. Sandwith, your lecture surfaces some really important messages. Of course, the meaning and the value of the archive. Also important, the relevance of the periodical print culture and public sphere debates for the recovery of hidden intellectual cultural traditions in South Africa. And thirdly, the idea that you explain that the reconstruction of this alternative archive requires a methodology of reading and, of course, historicizing the fragment, which you claim involves the analysis of traces, leftovers, bits and pieces, which you describe to be oddments and remainders, powerful grammar and language. Fourthly, you motivate a conceptual frame that has methodological implications, which indicates that to work with the discontinuous, the incomplete archive of South African intellectual life demands, of necessity, a reading of gaps and a reading across those gaps. Fifthly, you suggest that such a reading strategy is an always provisional methodology of juxtaposition and tentative assemblage, and an equally tentative analysis of the patterns these fragments form and the ways in which they might shift over time. And finally, and perhaps more importantly, the significance of all of this at a semantic level confirm that meaning is never foreclosed, but always under construction. Distinguished guests, Prof. Sandwith's inaugural lecture also gives us cause for reassurance that the issues she raises should not remain marginal nor eroded, but must be fresh, alive, nuanced, and actively engaged in our academic project. Colleagues, of course, my job will not be complete without also thanking those who faultlessly worked behind the scenes to make this inaugural a reality. Vice-Chancellor and Principal, Prof. Coupe, to you for your role this evening, members of the University Executive for your support, the Faculty of Humanities Executive, Professor Molly Brown and staff from the Department of English, Heather Tainsma and Daneline van den Berg from the Dean's Office, staff from the Future Africa Campus and Louis Kluter Productions. Visitors have joined, including friends and, of course, the family of Prof. Sandwith, who are with us tonight. Thank you for your presence. I invite you to once more join me in congratulating Prof. Sandwith on her inaugural lecture. Please, of course, feel free to leave a message in the chat feature on your screen. And to our live stream audience, I wish you a warm spring evening and good night. Gaudiamus igitur